Have you heard the story of when a Mormon congressman from Utah was refused his seat from the United States House of Representatives? There's been a lot of discussion lately about congressmen acting badly. We've had both a Democrat, Eric Swalwell from California, as well as a Republican, Tony Gonzalez from Texas, who resigned their seats from Congress, in part because they were likely going to be expelled. And across the history of the United States, we've had 21 congressmen expelled from their seats, 15 from the Senate, and 6 from the House of Representatives. Though that number is a bit misleading because most of them took place in a small period during the Civil War, though we have had some recent instances in December 2023 when George Santos was expelled from the House of Representatives. Although not included in that number of those expelled from Congress, the prominent LDS author, apologist, theologian, and ecclesiastical authority B.H. Roberts also holds a very similar distinction. He was elected in 1898 to represent Utah, but was denied his seat in the House of Representatives. It's a fascinating story, yet one that often gets overlooked, often in favor of the much more famous Reed-Smoot trials in the Senate that took place a few years later. Go check out my video on the Reed-Smoot trials if you haven't seen it. Perhaps one of the reasons Roberts' case isn't as well remembered is because, unlike Smoot, he lost. And that failure was at least in part due to one core portion of the LDS constituency not supporting him. So in this video, I want to do a few things. One, I'll explain the context for B.H. Roberts' election and denial. Two, I'll survey the political and cultural debate that then ensued. I'll then detail how Roberts' defeat was, at least in part, due to opposition within his own community. And then I'll touch on some of the lasting legacies. It's a fascinating story that very few people know, but I think can give us some really important insights. So let's dig in. By way of background, B.H. Roberts, one of the most famous authors, historians, theologians, apologists in LDS history, was born in England, migrated to Utah as a young child in the 1870s, served a mission in the U.S. South, including some very daring stories of retrieving the bodies of some slain LDS missionaries, spent time on the run due to his polygamous marriages and the underground period where the government was trying to arrest and imprison polygamists, and then eventually he was arrested and imprisoned for his polygamous wives. He then became a prominent author, writing several books that became curriculum to the LDS Church, and served in the ecclesiastical position within the Council of 70, as it was called. He was also a devout Democrat. He wasn't comfortable with how a lot of LDS leaders like George Cannon were pushing members to join the Republican Party during the 1890s, a political divide that I've talked about in previous videos. He, in fact, was nearly dropped from his ecclesiastical position when he opposed the church installing what was known as the Political Manifesto in the 1890s, where church leaders had to get approval from higher authorities if they wanted to run for office. Though eventually he earned his way back into the church's good graces, and all was well. And after Utah finally became a state and achieved statehood in January of 1896, he hoped to take advantage of this new period where Latter-day Saints seemed to be more welcome on the national stage. They were fulfilling what was expected of them. And so, in part, they seemed to be working within the two-party system. So why not fulfill his long-held ambitions and be elected as a congressman? But that raises a question. Is the United States ready in 1898 to accept not just a Mormon congressman, but a polygamist congressman? Before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Every Monday I do a deep dive on a particular topic, like stories like, for instance, the one on B.H. Roberts that I'm covering today. On Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present and explain the background for what brought us to various moments and how that is expressed in things like politics, media, TV shows, cinema, documentaries. And then on Friday, I pull back the curtain and talk about the historian's craft, interviewing authors, dissecting new books, or digging into the sources behind historiographical claims so that you too can become an expert on history. And if you want to give back to this channel, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member, where for a nominal fee, you get early access to videos, you get little icons next to your name, and most importantly, you feel good for supporting a public-facing historical content on this channel. I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter, as well as following me on different social media platforms where I provide supplemental information. Links to both of those are in the video description. And please mark your calendar for May 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time for my next live discussion on YouTube, where I will be talking with Lindsay Hansen Park, an expert on Mormon fundamentalism, as well as Mormonism and media, and we'll talk all things Mormon polygamists and TV and movies and so forth. It should be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to B.H. Roberts. So by 1898, B.H. Roberts felt that everything was in place for him to finally be elected to Congress, something that he had been yearning for quite a while. He had ran for office several times before that. Yet he received some opposition, both within his church, within the party, and then within the state. First of all, within the Democratic Party, there were plenty of non-Mormon Democratic leaders who were like, we're just now getting accepted on the national stage. Let's not tempt things by electing a Mormon ecclesiastical authority, and especially a polygamist. And so he faced some opposition in the primaries. He also faced opposition within the Democratic coalition among those who supported women's suffrage, because B.H. Roberts had opposed women's suffrage during the Utah State Constitutional Convention just a few years earlier. So women like Martha Hughes Cannon, the first woman elected to a state senator position in the nation, who was also a polygamous wife, she even opposed B.H. Roberts due to his stance on women's suffrage. And then once he made it out of the primaries, he faced opposition from the non-Mormon press in Utah, especially the Salt Lake Tribune, which really tried to expose what they saw as the downside, the corrupt underbelly of Mormonism, including their continued practice of polygamy. And they had lots of great political cartoons on Roberts, and I'll highlight a few later. And there's, of course, opposition from Republicans, including Mormons who were Republican leaders, including Emmeline B. Wells, one of the foremost Mormon women leaders at the time, who was a Republican, and she, like Martha Hughes Cannon, was also really upset that B.H. Roberts did not support women's suffrage, and so she actually got approval from the first presidency, notably George Q. Cannon, who was the powerful counselor and also a diehard Republican, who gave Emmeline B. Wells permission to launch an opposition opposing B.H. Roberts's campaign. And of course, it didn't help that one of B.H. Roberts's plural wives gave birth to twins during the campaign. Look at this political cartoon from the Salt Lake Tribune in which Roberts is speaking, and one of his political colleagues is in the background smoothing the twins, highlighting that this is what he's actually hiding in the background. However, Roberts is able to overcome all that opposition. He is elected in November 1898 after a brutal campaign, and here's the Salt Lake Tribune commemorating his victory, with B.H. Roberts celebrating, with his twins, of course, in the background, the twins from the plural wife, and saying, "Ha ha ha, there's my pa, he'll go to Washington, but he won't take my ma," highlighting that, of course, he's trying to put that polygamy behind him. But once he gets that position, what's going to happen when he arrives in Washington? That's a whole other issue. It's important to remember that the electoral calendar worked quite differently back then than it does today. Prior to the 20th Amendment, which is not going to be passed until a couple decades after the B.H. Roberts election, you would be elected in November, but then not take office for an entire year. Now, you can imagine why that was in place in the early years of America, where travel was a lot more difficult. But what this meant for B.H. Roberts is that between his election and his seating in Congress that was supposed to take place a year later, there was enough time for a devoted opposition movement to spring up across the nation. And there were lots of religious groups who saw the election of a Mormon polygamist as a danger to American morals. And so they petitioned their legislators. They formed protest meetings. They flooded the press with all these oppositional additional research, including lots of really hilarious political cartoons that you can find just going through the newspaper databases. And politicians as well were quite suspicious of B.H. Roberts. And this is rooted in a divided opinion, mixed assumptions over the compromise that brought Utah in the state. On the one hand, the Mormons believed that what they conceded with the manifesto was that they could continue living with their plural wives already solemnized before 1890, but they just couldn't take on any new plural wives. However, the non-Mormon politicians believed that what the Mormons promised to in 1890 was that they would give up polygamy altogether, including the dissolution of their current wives. It's unclear which side was actually correct in these assumptions. I think both were genuinely interpreting those amnesty clauses in those agreements in different ways, but it had substantial problems for B.H. Roberts because he was a polygamist. He had married 3 wives. 2 of them were before the manifesto, and one of them he was married to after the manifesto, which is going to cause a lot of problems. So when B.H. Roberts arrived in Washington in December 1899, a year after his election, there was already a vigorous national campaign to make sure he couldn't be seated. Religious groups had flooded the nation with these long scrolls with hundreds of thousands of signatures, and the Salt Lake Tribune back in Utah was providing evidence that B.H. Roberts was having children with his polygamous wives and may have even been sealed to his 3rd wife after the manifesto. So when Roberts arrives, congressmen are questioning whether they should certify his election. Could Mormons be trusted? Could Roberts actually be a polygamist? And of course, the Republicans, who were in the majority, were looking for a way to embarrass the Democrats, of which Roberts was a party. So Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution said that Congress can, quote, be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications for its own members, which at that point, and this isn't going to change for a few decades after this, they believed that they could refuse a seat on a politician if they deemed them someone who breaks the laws, a lawless person who does not fit their moral standards of Congress. That means when B.H. Roberts heard his name called for the first roll call for certification on December 4th, 1899, there were immediate objections within the House. They argued that Roberts, like most Mormons, had received amnesty in the years following 1890, but that Roberts had violated that agreement by continuing to live polygamy, as well as potentially adding a 3rd plural wife. Democrats responded that Roberts had been democratically elected, and whatever his legal standing was, that's besides the point, that if we believe in a democracy, we need to trust the voice of the voters. This then prompted several weeks of debate, including the calling of dozens of witnesses, showing that Roberts continued to have children from the 2 plural wives, and also raising issues of his alleged marriage to Margaret Shipp, going so far as raising up addresses that Shipp had used so they could swear that she was actually living with B.H. Roberts. And it also didn't help that B.H. Roberts burned a lot of bridges with his demeanor, often refusing to give an inch and not willing to play by the congressional rules. So eventually, Congress decided to not allow Roberts to take his seat, to not certify his election. They had formed this committee that did the investigation, and the committee's majority report ruled that the election of Roberts was, quote, a violation of the understanding by which Utah was admitted as a state. And even the minority report that was in favor of Roberts getting a seat said that once he gets a seat, he should probably be expelled. So it's not going well for you if the report that's allegedly on your side is saying, yes, he should get a seat, but then he should be expelled. Roberts, before Congress took their final vote, rose and gave a blistering address that is pretty prototypical Roberts, and I'll just read one portion of it. The power to brand with shame rests with each man and nowhere else. The Almighty God has conferred it upon no one else. I have lived up to this day in all good conscience and harmony with the moral teachings of the community in which I was reared, and am sensible of no act of shame in my life. Why, if you finally determine either to exclude or expel me, I shall leave this august chamber with head held erect and brow undaunted, and walk upon God's earth as the angels walk the clouds, with no sense of shame upon me. And if in response to the sectarian clamor that has been invoked against me, you violate the constitution of your country, either in excluding or expelling me, all the shame that there is in this case will be left behind me, and rest with the House. His plea does not work. Congress voted on January 25th, 1900 to deny Roberts' seat, and it wasn't really close. The resolution to exclude him passed with 268 votes in favor and 50 against. I will say that some of those politicians later regretted their choice, not because they wanted Roberts in Congress, but later on there was a consensus that, according to the laws, they probably should have gave him the seat and then expelled him, which would have added him to what's eventually the other 6 congressmen to be expelled. Roberts would eventually be replaced by William King, who would later also serve as senator for the state of Utah for several decades. But while you can see the political shenanigans taking place in Utah and expect the august opposition from Protestants, the failure of Roberts' side is at least in part due to some of his own community. So remember, the cultural context had already set the tone before Congress even met in December of 1899. So the question is, why didn't the church succeed in pushing back against this cultural outreach, especially due to some previous victories the church had had? Remember, they had succeeded in finally getting statehood. And the answer is that one of the tools that the church often used for cultural assimilation and winning political capital were women. The protests of these women activists had challenged traditional assumptions and showed how modern the church was, that they weren't as tyrannical or misogynist or dangerous or backward, because look at these great women who are willing to stand up for the faith. But they did not, these women agitators, chose not to fight on the side of B.H. Roberts. Their voices were silent, which was especially notable given that the Protestant women's voices were so influential in the anti-Roberts case. And perhaps the primary reason why Mormon women did not rise to the occasion to support B.H. Roberts is because Roberts had built a lot of animosity with Mormon women leaders, especially several years earlier at the Utah State Constitutional Convention, when he had come out and opposed women's suffrage. Now, he claimed that it was because we want our state constitution to look like other state constitutions, most of which barred women from voting. He also argued that it was a necessary concession for external intervention, but he also expressed some deeply misogynistic views that the women's proper sphere was in the home and they should not be in politics. And women did not forget that, especially several notable women, including Martha Hughes Cannon, who was a Democrat who did not really stand up for Roberts, but especially women like Emmeline B. Wells, who was a Republican. In fact, Emmeline B. Wells, her diaries are filled during these years with both her frustration at B.H. Roberts, her disgust when he's election, and even her joy when he is refused his seat. So in other words, it's a lesson that you don't piss off the Mormon women if you want the Mormon community to come to your support. The saga of B.H. Roberts being denied his seat in the House of Representatives has a number of key lessons. First, it showed the limits of assimilation for the Mormons in the United States in the decade following the Manifesto and Utah statehood. Second, it shows it's a crucial part of B.H. Roberts' own life, someone who becomes a central figure in Mormon history, especially due to his writings in the decades after this, and this shapes the way he views the American experiment. Third, it prompted prompted a new era of interrogation, both at the local and the national level, of how Mormons continued to practice polygamy, which are going to have long-term ramifications. And fourth, it causes the church to shift its approach in political intervention. 3 years later, when they elect Reed Smoot to the Senate, Smoot is fundamentally different than Roberts in several ways. He's a Republican, and he's monogamous. The two things that the church recognize are going to gain them more cultural and political acceptance in the decades going forward. Now, if you want to learn more about this fascinating topic, I have a couple suggestions for you. John Solito's biography, B.H. Roberts, A Life in the Public Sphere, published by Signature Books a couple of years ago, has 3 whole meaty chapters on this topic, which is very well done. And also the wonderful scholar and journalist Jana Reese has an essay titled Polygamy in the Nation's Capital, Protestant Women and the 1899 Campaign Against B.H. Roberts, which was published in a volume she and Randall Ballmer edited, Mormonism in American Politics. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've heard some of this before, I hope you appreciate the broader context. And if you've never heard of this case before, hopefully it broadens your perspective of the awkward and uneasy movement toward political and cultural assimilation that Mormonism embarked on in the wake of the Manifesto. History has never been more relevant than it is today. And if you agree with that, if you want to support this work, please like this video, share it with friends, subscribe to the channel, and become a member if you want to give back. History can give so much context to us, even things that seem so radical and extreme as men who are put on trial due to their private actions, even when they are elected United States congressmen.